The reality is I don't think journalists are performing well when it comes to the question of striking balance or achieving objectivity, but in some respects it's not their fault at all. Journalism has been squeezed like higher education from both the political left and the political right. Journalism is increasingly an ideological exercise. It's an extension of people's activism. I think younger journalists, I'm quite happy to be on the record saying this, I think younger journalists, some of them, see journalism as an extension of their activism, and they are finding a home because a newspaper or a publication that was once a pretty centrist newspaper when it came to delivering news, maybe its editorial pages would tilt slightly one way or the other. They are disappearing. The way that you make a buck now, to the extent that you can make a buck in the media, is to have an ideological position. So the reality is, just as the Australian newspaper is unashamedly a newspaper of the centre-right, I think sadly a lot of its opinions are pretty predictable. I think The Guardian, for example, is just an unashamedly blanket and very predictable publication of the left, which is very different from The Guardian that I first read as a print publication when I was a young man in my 20s, travelling, living briefly in the UK. The New York Times is the same. When I was a student in New York in the mid to late 1990s, I used to read religiously the New York Times. There was a very distinct, neutral New York Times style of reportage. Certainly its editorial page tilted towards maybe the liberal left, but even the New York Times today delivers its news with attitude. And when I say it's not really the journalist's fault, it's because they've been told this is how you get traction online. This is how you get eyeballs on your copy, by delivering and speaking news and writing with attitude. And that's a real problem. This is where I say it's being squeezed by a certain ideology on the left, but an ideology on the right of neoliberalism. The way that any organisation now squeezes a buck out of its operations is to have minimal inputs, maximum outputs. So media organisations, and I fear this for the ABC, are heading towards a model. It's certainly been the case at Fairfax, where I worked for 14 years, where you have a few big-name marquee journalists at the top, and they're well paid, and then you have a group of, and then you have a much younger staff, people in their 20s, their early 30s, earning pretty modest salaries, and people at the middle and upper to middle levels of journalism, the people who, when I was 25 and wrote something foolish, who were in their late 30s and 40s, would step in and say, you really need to rethink this before we publish it. You'll regret what you're about to write in 5 years' time. It'll make you look foolish, or you're really not serving the purpose of journalism by being so ideological in your reportage. They no longer exist. There's very little filtering now. So a lot of what is published, as I say, is an extension of someone's activism. And when your boss encourages that, and when you're encouraged to be on Twitter, which is a career killer, in my view, for many journalists, because it's there forever, even if you pull it down, someone's captured a ridiculous tweet that you've set out, which is the reason I'm not on social media, because I can be, I'm as prone to flights of fury or whatever as the next person, but those filters no longer exist.